What will the future of the wide receiver position look like for the Jets? What will the offensive line look like in a couple of weeks? What should the offense look like coming out of the bye? We'll discuss all this and more on today's mailbag edition of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, November 9th, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and it's available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button wherever you are watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps the channel out and it helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. Well, the Jets are in their bye week, and today we have our weekly mailbag. Each week we try and do a mailbag show on Wednesday. Thank you so much to everybody who sent in questions, and we begin with a question on the Jets offense. John, do you see the Jets beginning to open up the offense more, or do you see them staying conservative until Wilson shows significant improvements? With the line getting more healthy and Corey Davis returning, it seems like this should allow the Jets to be a little bit more aggressive on offense when they need to be. I think the Jets are going to need to get more aggressive. I think they are going to need to open things up a bit more than they have. Really, the one time it felt like they kind of opened the offense up was against New England a couple weeks ago, and obviously that did not go very well. I don't think what the Jets were doing during their winning streak was really sustainable. I mean, I don't think you can get so little from that passing game because, they had two of those wins of the 4 games that they won, the game against Green Bay and the game against Denver. The Jets threw for less than 125 yards. And then the game before that, the win over Miami, they threw for 200, but like 100 of them came from the running back Breece Hall making big plays. So Jets really were not getting much out of their passing game. On Sunday they did okay. They averaged, but they were not producing explosive plays on offense. I think they're going to have to open it up a bit. I just don't think that they're going to be able to sustain what they did on Sunday. Sunday's a great game plan if you can pull it off. It's the old manage the game, the keep the ball away, move the chains. You don't necessarily need big plays if you're consistently moving the chains, you're keeping the other team on the sidelines. That's a great plan if it works. It usually does not work, though. And usually to win games in the NFL, you've got to produce big plays. The Jets have been getting a lot of big plays from Breece Hall, or they were at least before he got injured. That's obviously off the table now, so they need to lean more on their passing game. On yesterday's show, I talked about this a bit, how even though they play different positions, in some ways, Garrett Wilson is kind of taking the role of Breece Hall in that he's becoming, I think, the go-to guy, and he's a guy who I think can produce some of the explosive plays that the Jets need. This is not going to be a Zach Wilson-based offense going forward. He's still young, he's still learning the game, still, kind of inexperienced, still figuring things out. So I think this is a team that needs to rely on the run game more than your typical team. I don't think they can go to the extremes they've gone to so far. I think at some point something's going to have to give. And this is part of it, is that I think slowly, in an ideal world, over the course of the next few years, they're going to be able to transition this offense to a point where it becomes a more Zach Wilson-centric offense. But it's got to be like kind of a slow transition where you just give him a little bit more here, a little bit more there. As he becomes comfortable with concepts, you can add additional ones in. I don't think it's going to be the type of thing where Zach Wilson's now going to be the driving force on offense, but I do think they're going to have to get a little bit more out of their passing game going forward. So, I think it's a situation where it's not going to be an extreme move, but I think they are going to need to open things up, especially with Davis returning. And again, if the Jets get some offensive linemen back here, that certainly will help. Our next question is from Greg. John, Chris Herndon had an encouraging rookie season and a disappointing year 2. Denzel Mims had an encouraging rookie year and a disappointing year 2. Elijah Moore had an encouraging year 1 and a disappointing year 2. What do you make of this, and is there reason to be concerned about Garrett Wilson's year 2 based on the recent trend? You never know how a guy is going to develop, so I don't want to make guarantees about Garrett Wilson because we don't even know how his rookie year is going to end. That said, I mean, I don't think just because those guys looked pretty good in year 1, it necessarily follows that Garrett Wilson's going to struggle in year two. The two really are not related. One player's trajectory doesn't really matter for another player's trajectory. I mean, most of those guys, aside from Elijah Moore, began year one with different coaching staffs. And here's the other thing. I mean, these other guys, Herndon, Mims, and Moore, they were all fine as rookies, but they were not stars. They were on a trajectory where you said, okay, that's a promising year one. Let's see if they can improve it going forward as they move into their second season. They were not playing at the level Garrett Wilson is playing at as a rookie. Garrett Wilson right now, it looks like he's going to challenge for 1,000 yards. Garrett Wilson right now looks like a difference maker at this moment. Those three other guys all had individual moments. And to be honest with you, for Herndon and Mims, they really weren't that special. They played a couple decent games. Moore had a good stretch the middle of last season, but that was no guarantee he was going to end up being a star-level performer. Garrett Wilson is playing at a much higher level right now, so he's established a higher trajectory. And those other guys, as much as anything, you were looking for them to take a step forward in year two. You were not necessarily looking at them at that point and saying, this guy's a star right now. You were saying, this is a good beginning to his career. Hopefully he can take a step forward. But I go back to my original point. Just because these guys happen to be pass catchers who played for the Jets who had a sophomore slump, that does not mean there's no curse here. These are all individual players, and they all struggled for their own individual reasons. Herndon had a suspension, and then he kept getting injured. Mims, had his own problems, and the Elijah Moore issues are we've seen what's happened there. So those are all individual cases. I don't think there's any reason to suspect Garrett Wilson's going to have problems year two. It's always possible, but it's not really doesn't have any one really. I don't think has anything to do with the other. So I'm not overly concerned with something like that. Our next question: who are your unsung heroes on the offense and the defense? We all know the big players. We've heard about Garrett Wilson. We've heard about Breece Hall. We've heard about Sauce. We've heard about Quinnen Williams. But who do you think is the unsung hero of the offense and the unsung hero of the defense? On offense, I have to go with Corey Davis because this was a guy who the fans really got on last season. And he did not have a great season, but it was nowhere near as bad as people made it out to be. There were actually some really good individual games Corey Davis had. But one of the things you have to do with these players, you have to look at how a season compares to the rest of their career. And if a guy's having a season that's way better than the rest of his career, odds are the next year he's not going to be as good. And the reverse is true. If you have a guy like Corey Davis, who for most of his career has been a really solid receiver, and then he has a bad season, well, odds are he's going to bounce back from that bad season, and he's going to get better. And I think he's been a really important player for Zach Wilson. Now, the Jets have obviously missed him the last couple of weeks, but he's the guy Zach Wilson trusted the most when he returned. And there were a couple key plays in that comeback against Pittsburgh, which was the best football Zach Wilson's played in his career, in my view, where he was looking to Corey Davis first and foremost. So it shows you the importance of Corey Davis in this offense. And I think I mentioned this week that in a way maybe losing him, if it's good that it's not a longer-term injury. I'd have a different view if this was a longer-term injury. But because it's a short-term injury, maybe it's a blessing in disguise that Davis went down because he's it gives forces Zach Wilson to trust Garrett Wilson a little bit more. On the defensive side of the ball, depends on what your view is unsung is, because I could go DJ Reed easily, because Sauce Gardner gets all the attention. DJ Reed's been outstanding. He's been almost as good as Sauce Gardner. This is like what the guy you want in free agency. You want the guy who's kind of under the radar, but a really good player. This is the best kind of free agent signings you have. DJ Reed's the best free agent signing I can remember the Jets have made in some time. But if DJ Reed's too high profile, Michael Carter II, the slot corner, who's I think is playing excellent football, and a guy who flies even further under the radar because Sauce Gardner gets most of the attention. DJ Reed gets a little attention. Nobody's talking about Michael Carter II. I think he's playing really good football in the slot. So I think the Jets have three corners who can cover really well. Now, head here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we will turn our attention to the offensive line. The Jets could have some players getting healthy. What should the line look like once everybody's back at full strength? I'll tell you what I think as we continue this Wednesday mailbag episode. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is sponsored by SimpliSafe. If you've thought about securing your home with home security but have been putting it off, you'll want to listen up. Right now, Locked On Jets listeners can order the #1 rated SimpliSafe home security system for 50% off. This is their biggest offer of the year, and you don't want to miss it. SimpliSafe was named the best home security system of 2022 by U.S. News and World Report, the third year in a row. In an emergency, 24/7 professional monitoring agents used Fast Protect technology exclusively from SimpliSafe to capture critical evidence and verify the threat is real, so you can get priority police response. SimpliSafe is whole home security with advanced sensors for every room, window, and door. HD security cameras for inside and out. Smarter ways to detect motion that alert you only when a threat is real. And even hazard sensors that detect fires, floods, and other threats to your home. 24/7 professional monitoring service costs less than $1 a day, less than half the price of ADT's traditional professionally installed system. Get 50% off any new SimpliSafe system at simplisafe.com/lockedonnfl. This is their biggest discount of the year, so don't wait. That's SimpliSafe, simplisafe.com/lockedonnfl. There's no safe like SimpliSafe. Thank you again for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms. Our next question in our weekly mailbag: what do you think Fant's role on the offensive line is if he comes back healthy? If Brown is still good to go at left tackle, then is Fant moving to right tackle? I think that's exactly what's going to happen. Right now, the Jets have Cedric Ogbuehi playing at right tackle. That's just not sustainable. I mean, this was a guy who wasn't even on the team at the beginning of the season. He was a guy who was available, who the Jets signed. They just had so many injuries at the tackle position. These things have a way of working themselves out, though, because a few weeks ago, I think people were asking, well, what happens when Fant comes back? Does Elijah Vera Tucker move back to guard? Well, as we know, Elijah Vera Tucker got injured. So, sometimes these situations change overnight, but realistically, I think Fant plays right tackle. He's the best right tackle the Jets will have available. He's not a great player by any stretch of the imagination. He obviously was not having a very good year, although I think part of it was that he was playing hurt. But Brown's kind of struggled recently. He got off to a really hot start, then had a couple rough games at left tackle. But I think the Jets' best alignment right now is probably Brown at left tackle, Fant at right tackle. But that could change too, because Brown is also playing injured. It's also quite clear that Dwayne Brown is not 100%, and I've openly wondered, how long is he going to last? And if he goes down, then maybe Fant moves to left tackle, and maybe once Max Mitchell returns, he goes to right tackle. So there's a lot up in the air, and there's a lot that's unknown right now. So it's difficult. It's in some ways it's difficult to answer. But I think if the status quo remains, Fant plays right tackle. I think he's better than Max Mitchell. Listen, Max Mitchell did his best out there. But it was clear. There were points where it was clear he was not drafted to play this year. He's still got to put some upper body strength on. He's got to hit the weight room. This was not a guy the Jets had any intention of putting on the field this year. And for the most part, for Max Mitchell, he struggled. There were a couple games where he was okay, but for the most part, I thought it was kind of a struggle. Our next question: what are your thoughts on the wide receiver and tight end units now and in the future? Besides Garrett Wilson being a star, do you see any real positives? I don't know if Davis is retained past the season, and the previous second rounders are total concerns. As for the tight ends, are they getting better? Well, we can begin with the tight ends. It would be tough to get worse than the Jets' tight ends were at the beginning of the season. Tight end's a weakness. I don't think there's any question about that. Tyler Conklin had a good game, a couple of weeks ago against New England, but he's been a disaster. And CJ Uzomah's pretty much been invisible. Aside from a few, he's made a few catches over the last couple of weeks, but CJ Uzomah's been invisible. Jeremy Ruckert not getting active on Sunday over Kenny Yeboah getting active over Jeremy Ruckert seems ominous for Ruckert. The only time we saw Ruckert this year, he dropped an easy pass. No, I don't want to write him off. So, tight end seems to remain an issue right now for this team. The Jets, for whatever reason, just can never figure out tight end. Now, at the receiver position, Garrett Wilson looks great. Garrett Wilson looks like he might be developing into a number one type receiver. After that, I think you got to keep Corey Davis after this year. We'll see how the rest of the season goes. The view on this can always change depending on how events come about. But Corey Davis is an important player for this team, and he's a guy Zach Wilson really trusts. He's not making that much money. And that was one of the things that got missed in this. People were talking about Corey Davis last year like he was making elite receiver money. He was making a good starting receiver money, which is what he is. He's a good starting receiver. So I think you keep Corey Davis around, but the other spot's a question mark. Mims obviously had that big catch on Sunday. He brings certain skills to the table. I think what you've seen with Mims are, first of all, he can use his big body to box guys out, and that can happen down the field when he wins a ball in the air. He can high point a ball. On Sunday, he used that big body to create a throwing lane, and he's also tough to bring down when he's got the ball in his hands. He's a big physical runner after the catch. There are things he doesn't do well. He's obviously not a great route runner. I don't think he's great at creating separation. I don't think he plays anywhere close to his time to speed as a 4.3 40 guy. He's not. I mean, maybe he's a 4.3 40 guy when you line him up and ask him to run a straight line, in a track and field situation. But I don't think he plays anywhere close to that speed in a game setting. So, he's a more limited guy. I view Mims right now as kind of more of a quality backup than I do view him as a guy who's a starting receiver. And Elijah Moore, I mean, the weird thing with Elijah Moore is he actually got off to a pretty good start this season. He looked like a guy who, if he was not developing into a star, was developing into a nice complementary receiver, and then just everything collapsed. It's really difficult to understand where things went wrong because, again, it's not like this began during the offseason. See, last year with Mims, everything began in the offseason. You began to get the first hints of this, that something was wrong. With Moore, the season began okay, and then just this thing came out of nowhere. So it's difficult to say what's going on with Moore. But listen, I think it's always important when you're dealing with a young quarterback. There's a perception. This is my least favorite type of team building, is the idea that you only focus on areas where you're weakest. You always want to layer. You always want to add more talents. You want to add more playmaking when you're trying to develop a young quarterback. You can never have enough playmaking around a young quarterback. So I think that this is a situation where the Jets should always be looking to add another playmaker. Because, you saw what happened with Breece Hall. Breece Hall was so important to this offense. And one of the reasons they've been able to weather the storm is that they had Garrett Wilson. So you can never have too many playmakers. So even though the Jets maybe it's not a weakness, I still think you look to add in the offseason once you get there. And obviously this could change depending on what happens over the course of the last couple weeks of the season. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we will close out our weekly mailbag. We're going to talk about the Johnson brothers. Will they be able to stay out of Joe Douglas's and Robert Saleh's business? That's as we continue this Wednesday episode. Today's episode is brought to you by Blue Nile. Whether you're looking to pop the question, have a milestone to celebrate, or want to let your love sparkle, Blue Nile can help you make your celebrations even more memorable. As the original online jeweler, Blue Nile offers the largest selection of independently graded diamonds at pieces priced significantly below traditional retailers. Blue Nile has helped millions of couples create their perfect engagement ring. Their easy online tools help you choose the diamond, shape, size, clarity, as well as setting style. Blue Nile's bench of jewelers will then help you handcraft her perfect one-of-a-kind engagement ring. If you're looking for a piece of jewelry to commemorate a special milestone, but still are having trouble choosing, Blue Nile has jewelry experts on hand 24/7, available via phone or chat to help you find a memorable gift at every budget. Shop stress-free with Blue Nile's 100% satisfaction guarantee. All Blue Nile orders are insured and shipped free in discreet packaging. They also offer overnight shipping if you're in a rush. Make your moment sparkle with Blue Nile. Go to BlueNile.com and use code LOCKEDON to save $50 on your purchase of $500 or more. That's BLUENILE.com, code LOCKEDON to save $50 on your purchase of $500 or more. BlueNile.com, code LOCKEDON. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Wednesday, doing our weekly mailbag show. Our next question, John, can you give your thoughts on the Colts hiring Jeff Saturday as interim head coach? Well, obviously, I'm not a Colts expert, but to me, it seems like the owner just wanted to put a recognizable name that the fans would love. I feel this is also a situation where it feels to me like they're looking inward. The owner's looking for somebody that he knows. It doesn't really matter if the guy's qualified. You see this a lot in sports. You see this a lot in other areas too, where your team struggle, your situation is a struggle. So you just go to somebody you know, whether or not they're qualified for the job or not. To be honest with you, I think NFL teams do head coaching hires wrong, and I think the quote-unquote qualifications for jobs frequently show very little correlation to how successful a coach is. So I don't think a lack of experience is necessarily as big of a deal as people make it out to be. But there are limits to that. I think at some level you have to understand how to run a staff. You have to understand how to run meetings. I think at some level you have to be around it for a little while. I would have less of an issue with this if the Colts were bringing somebody in from their front office to run the team. It doesn't necessarily need to be somebody from your coaching staff, but sometimes the front office guys are on the headsets during game day. They're in the booth. And I don't think you need a lot of time, but I think bringing somebody in completely from the outside who has no coaching experience, it's a weird move. I don't think it makes that. Look, the Colts weren't going anywhere anyway this year, so I guess it doesn't make that big of a difference. But it's just, I guess, for like a bigger picture thing, it just shows you that you have an owner who doesn't really know what he's doing, an owner who's not really making sound decisions. I guess if I was a Colts fan, that's what would bother me more than anything, because this is just, it's like nepotism. He's going with a guy he knows, whether or not the guy's qualified or not. It shows it's not going to impact the team this year, but it shows that the decision-making long-term is not really what you want. And that's my view on Jeff Saturday. So you can certainly hear more about that if you go over to Locked On Colts. Our next question. I know the Jets are a good team. I think the quarterback is the biggest question they have. The draft for next year should be offensive line and linebacker depth. The coaching staff is not much of a question mark. The question is whether the Johnsons can stay out of it. Well, I think they will. You never know, and a losing streak here or there could cause issues, but I don't see the Johnsons jumping in right now. Everything's going well. So if you're the Johnson brothers, I think where the Johnsons get into trouble is when the team's losing, because when the team's losing, they really have no idea what to do. But when the team's winning, you just let the people run the team. That's what they did the Rex Tannenbaum days. And, obviously that did not end well. Tannenbaum made some bad decisions. Rex kind of regressed as a coach as his tenure progressed, but those first couple of years, it's not like they were in there destroying everything. Listen, the expectations for this year were for the team to improve. There's very little doubt the team's improved. I don't think many of us were expecting the team to improve so much so soon, but with the team improving and everybody giving good press, I mean, there's not really much for the Johnsons to go in and meddle with. I mean, they see that they're probably really happy right now because they've been frustrated with the losing. I mean, say what you will about the Johnsons, and there's a lot you can say negative about them. They want to win. There's no question they want to win. There's no question they want the team to be successful. So with the people that they hired looking so successful, there's not really much for them to mess around with. A year or two from now, if the Jets are struggling, that's maybe where you worry about them jumping in. But I don't see it happening this year because there's just too much good happening, and there's no rationale for it. And they've never been a team when the team's doing well to mess around with it. When the team gets bad, that's where they start interjecting themselves, and that's where you get into trouble. But at 6-3, I think you're in good shape. I don't think you have to worry about the Johnsons in the near term. That's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button wherever you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. Give this episode a big thumbs up if you enjoy it. And if you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. Have a great Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.